Hello once again, I'm Don Jackson with the heartbeat of the internet. One learns, first of all, in beach living, the art of shedding, how little one can get along with, not how much. One does not need a whole closet full, only a small suitcase full, and what a relief it is. To start, an excerpt from the writing of Anne Lindbergh. I think you could attribute the saying, living out of a suitcase, to that writing. And when we travel for business or pleasure, we live out of what we've been able to pack in a suitcase. Consider this quote. Every man has a train of thought on which he rides when he is alone. The dignity and nobility of his life, as well as his happiness, descend upon the direction in which that train is going, the baggage it carries, and the scenery through which it travels. Joseph Fort Newton with what is sometimes a painful but powerful truth. Let me lighten your burden somewhat. I'll carry your bags for you during this webcast. This is not quite a suitcase, but it is emotional baggage. It's called a bag of potatoes. One of my teachers had each one of us bring a clear plastic bag and a sack of potatoes to class. For every person we'd refused to forgive in our life, we were told to choose a potato, write on it the name and date, and put it in the plastic bag. Some of our bags, as you can imagine, were quite heavy. We were then told to carry this bag with us everywhere for 1 week, putting it beside our bed at night, on the car seat when driving, next to our desk at work. The hassle of lugging this around with us made it clear what a weight we were carrying spiritually and how we had to pay attention to it all the time, to not forget and keep leaving it in embarrassing places. Naturally, the condition of the potatoes deteriorated to a nasty slime. This was a great metaphor for the price we pay for keeping our pain and heavy negativity. Too often we think of forgiveness as a gift to the other person, and while that's true, it clearly is also a gift for ourselves. End quote. As I mentioned, it certainly isn't a suitcase, but it might as well be some of the unnecessary luggage we burden ourselves with. This next observation was made by those who traveled to little rural villages in Africa, where life is not quite as complicated as that in the West. This is an excerpt from the 1990 edition of the Friendship Book of Francis Gay, published by D.C. Thompson and Company, and I quote, "When an African has a heavy load to carry, he will often tie it to one end of a pole with a stone of equal weight fastened to the other. Then, with the pole across his shoulder, he is able to carry his load in the easiest possible way. It's the same idea as packing our holiday luggage into 2 small suitcases to balance one another when we're carrying them, rather than in one large heavy bag that weighs us down. It works that way in life too. Many people have found that the best way to cope with their own troubles is to help to carry someone else's as well. By turning their attention to the problems of another person, it becomes much easier to forget their own." Simple but true. This is an excerpt from the 1990 edition of the Friendship Book of Francis Gay. Gay writes, and again I quote, "William Cobbett, the author of Rural Rides and a keen agriculturalist, tells of a man who lost his job by insisting on going for lunch on the stroke of the hour, although he knew his boss needed his services a little bit longer. As he was leaving one day, his employer told him not to come back. It is often said that if something needs doing, then ask the busiest person you know to tackle it. He or she will make time, will go the extra mile. That phrase originated because a Roman soldier could compel one of the inhabitants of an occupied country to carry his baggage for a mile, but no farther. To go the extra mile came to mean doing more than was requested and doing it willingly. End quote. We have gotten to the point that we no longer have to carry anyone's belongings unless we want to. But where our own baggage is concerned, maybe we should think about how much we really need. Carol Wolper in the Los Angeles Magazine wrote, and I quote, "Here's how I learned the art of traveling light. During a particularly bad time in my life, I had to put my stuff in storage and move in with a friend. All I could think about was how great it would be when I was resettled and could get it back. This stuff assumed a level of major importance until 8 months later when I got my own place. On reopening those boxes, I thought, what was I thinking? Not only have I gotten along just fine without all this, I can't figure out why I was so attached to it in the first place." This is a poem by an unknown writer. It was a rainy night in New Orleans at a bus station in the town. I watched a young girl weeping as her baggage was taken down. It seems she'd lost her ticket changing buses in the night. She begged them not to leave her there with no sign of help in sight. The bus driver had a face of stone, and his heart was surely the same. "Losing your ticket's like losing cash money," he said, and left her in the rain. Then an old Indian man stood up and blocked the driver's way, and would not let him pass before he said what he had to say. "How can you leave that girl out there? Have you no God to fear? You know she had a ticket. You just can't leave her here. You can't put her out in a city where she doesn't have a friend. You will meet your schedule, but she might meet her end." The driver showed no sign that he'd heard or even cared about the young girl's problem or how her travels fared. So the old gentleman said, "For her fare I'll pay. I'll give her a little money to help her on her way." He went and bought the ticket and helped her to her place, and helped her put her baggage in the overhead luggage space. "How can I repay," she said, "the kindness you've shown tonight? We're strangers who won't meet again. A mere thank you doesn't seem right." He said, "What goes around comes around. This I've learned with time. What you give, you always get back. What you sow, you reap in kind. Always be helpful to others and give what you can spare. For by being kind to strangers, we help angels unaware." Whatever you do, you certainly don't want to pack your bags for this trip. This is called Leaving the City of Regret by Larry Harp, and I quote, "I had not really planned on taking a trip this time of year, and yet I found myself packing rather hurriedly. This trip was going to be unpleasant, and I knew in advance that no real good would come of it. I'm taking my annual guilt trip. I got tickets to fly there on Wish I Had Airlines. It was an extremely short flight. I got my baggage, which I could not check. I chose to carry it myself all the way. It was weighted down with 1,000 memories of what might have been. No one greeted me as I entered the terminal to the Regret City International Airport. I say international because people from all over the world come to this dismal town. As I checked into the Last Resort Hotel, I noticed that they would be hosting the year's most important event, the annual pity party. I wasn't going to miss that great social occasion. Many of the town's leading citizens would be there. First, there would be the Dunn family. You know, should have, would have, and could have. Then came the I Had family. You probably know Old Wish and his clan. Of course, the opportunities would be present, missed, and lost. The biggest family would be the Yesterdays. There are far too many of them to count, but each one would have a very sad story to share. Then, Shattered Dreams would surely make an appearance. And It's Their Fault would regale us with stories, excuses about how things had failed in his life. And each story would be loudly applauded by Don't Blame Me and I Couldn't Help It. Well, to make a long story short, I went to this depressing party, knowing that there would be no real benefit in doing so. And, as usual, I became very depressed. But as I thought about all the stories of failures brought back from the past, it occurred to me that all of this trip and subsequent pity party could be canceled by me. I started to truly realize that I did not have to be there. I didn't have to be depressed. One thing kept going through my mind. I can't change yesterday, but I do have the power to make today a wonderful day. I can be happy, joyous, fulfilled, encouraged, as well as encouraging. Knowing this, I left the city of regret immediately and left no forwarding address. Am I sorry for the mistakes I've made in the past? Yes, but there is no physical way to undo them. So, if you're planning a trip to the city of regret, please cancel all your reservations now. Instead, take a trip to a place called Starting Again. I liked it so much that I've taken up permanent residence there. My neighbors, the I Forgive Myselfs and the New Starts, are so very helpful. By the way, you don't have to carry around heavy baggage because the load is lifted from your shoulders upon arrival. If you can find it, it's in your own heart. Please look me up. I live on I Can Do It Street. This is called The Cookie Thief by Valerie Cox, featured in a third serving of Chicken Soup for the Soul. And I quote, "A woman was waiting at an airport one night, with several long hours before her flight. She hunted for a book in the airport shop, bought a bag of cookies, and found a place to drop. She was engrossed in her book, but happened to see that the man beside her, as bold as could be, grabbed a cookie or two from the bag between, which she tried to ignore to avoid a scene. She read, munched cookies, and watched the clock as the gutsy cookie thief diminished her stock. She was getting more irritated as the minutes ticked by, thinking, if I wasn't so nice, I'd blacken his eye. With each cookie she took, he took one too. When only one was left, she wondered what he'd do. With a smile on his face and a nervous laugh, he took the last cookie and broke it in half. He offered her half as he ate the other. She snatched it from him and thought, oh, brother, this guy has some nerve, and he's also rude. Why, he didn't even show any gratitude. She had never known when she had been so galled, and sighed with relief when her flight was called. She gathered her belongings and headed for the gate, refusing to look back at the thieving ingrate. She boarded the plane and sank in her seat, then sought her book, which was almost complete. As she reached in her baggage, she gasped with surprise. There was her bag of cookies in front of her eyes. If mine are here, she moaned with despair, then the others were his, and he tried to share. Too late to apologize, she realized with grief that she was the rude one, the ingrate, the thief. No cookies this time, but Twinkies and a root beer. This is called An Afternoon in the Park by Julie A. Manhan from Condensed Chicken Soup for the Soul. And I quote, "There once was a little boy who wanted to meet God. He knew it was a long trip to where God lived, so he packed his suitcase with Twinkies and a six-pack of root beer and started on his journey. When he had gone about 3 blocks, he met an old woman. She was sitting in the park, just staring at some pigeons. The boy sat down next to her and opened his suitcase. He was about to take a drink from his root beer when he noticed that the old lady looked hungry, so he offered her a Twinkie. She gratefully accepted it and smiled at him. Her smile was so pretty that the boy wanted to see it again, so he offered a root beer, and once again she smiled at him. The boy was delighted. They sat there all afternoon eating and smiling, but they never said a word. As it began to grow dark, the boy realized how tired he was, and he got up to leave. He turned around, ran back to the old woman, and gave her a big hug. She gave him her biggest smile ever. When the boy opened the door to his own house a short time later, his mother was surprised by the look of joy on his face. She asked him, "What did you do today that made you so happy?" He replied, "I had lunch with God. You know what? She's got the most beautiful smile I've ever seen." Meanwhile, the old woman, also radiant, returned to her home. Her son was stunned by the look of peace on her face, and he asked, "Mother, what did you do today that made you so happy?" She replied, "I ate Twinkies in the park with God." And before her son could reply, she added, "You know, he's much younger than I expected." End quote. Another writer once remarked, "Too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, or the smallest act of caring, all of which have the potential to turn life around." I will always remember this story, and I quote the original author. 20 years ago, I drove a cab for a living. It was a cowboy's life, a life for someone who wanted no boss. What I didn't realize was that it was also a ministry. Because I drove the night shift, My cab became a moving confessional. Passengers climbed in, sat behind me in total anonymity, and told me about their lives. I encountered people whose lives amazed me, ennobled me, made me laugh, made me weep, but none touched me more than a woman I picked up late one August night. I was responding to a call from a small brick fourplex in the quiet part of town. I assumed I was being sent to pick up some partiers or someone who had just had a fight with a lover. When I arrived at 2:30 a.m., the building was dark except for a single light in a ground floor window. Under these circumstances, many drivers would just honk once or twice, wait a minute, then drive away. But I had seen too many impoverished people who depended on taxis as their only means of transportation. Unless the situation smelled of danger, I always went to the door. This passenger might be someone who needs my assistance, I reasoned to myself. So I walked to the door and knocked. Just a minute, answered a frail, elderly voice. I could hear something being dragged across the floor. After a long pause, the door opened. A small woman in her 80s stood before me. She was wearing a print dress and a pillbox hat with a veil pinned on it, like somebody out of a 1940s movie. By her side was a small nylon suitcase. The apartment looked as if no one had lived in it for years. All the furniture was covered with sheets. There were no clocks on the walls, no knickknacks or utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with photos and glassware. "Would you carry my bag out to the car?" she said. I took the suitcase to the cab, then returned to assist the woman. She took my arm and we walked slowly toward the curb. She kept thanking me for my kindness. It's nothing, I told her. When we got in the cab, she gave me an address, then asked, "Could you drive through downtown?" "It's not the shortest way," I answered quickly. "Oh, I don't mind," she said. "I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to a hospice." I looked in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were glistening. "I don't have any family left," she continued. "The doctor says I don't have very long." I quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route would you like me to take?" I asked. For the next 2 hours we drove through the city. She showed me the building where she had once worked as an elevator operator. We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had me pull up in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a girl. Sometimes she'd ask me to slow in front of a particular building or corner and would sit staring into the darkness, saying nothing. As the first hint of sun was creasing the horizon, she suddenly said, "I'm tired. Let's go." We drove in silence to the address she had given me. It was a low building like a small convalescent home with a driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab as soon as we pulled up. They were solicitous and intent, watching her every move. They must have been expecting her. I opened the trunk and took the small suitcase to the door. The woman was already seated in a wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her purse. "Nothing," I said. "You have to make a living," she answered. "There are other passengers," I responded. Almost without thinking, I bent and gave her a hug. She held on to me tightly. "You gave an old woman a little moment of joy," she said. "Thank you." I squeezed her hand, then walked into the dim morning light. Behind me, a door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. I didn't pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly, lost in thought. For the rest of the day, I could hardly talk. What if that woman had gotten an angry driver, or one who was impatient to end his shift? What if I had refused to take the run, or had honked twice, then driven away? On a quick review, I don't think I've done anything more important in my life. We're conditioned to think that our lives revolve around great moments, but great moments often catch us unaware, beautifully wrapped in what others may consider a small one. End quote. I think we may have left one or two of your bags behind during the course of this webcast. I think you're feeling lighter already. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.